Hey guys, tonight, I need you to forget every Halloween version of this story you were ever told, because you were taught that Salem was about witches. It wasn't. Nobody in Salem was burned at the stake. Nobody flew. Nobody signed the devil's book in blood. What actually happened is worse, because every piece of it is sitting in court records you can still read today. Here is the piece they don't put on the souvenir mugs. On June 30th, 1692, a jury looked at a 71-year-old grandmother, a church member so respected that 39 of her neighbors risked their own necks to sign a petition for her and said the words "not guilty." She was hanged anyway, not by a mob, not in secret, by the court in writing with signatures. The verdict was reversed in that same room within the hour, because a judge leaned forward and asked the jury to think again, and the man who made that happen never apologized, not once. He died as the acting governor of Massachusetts. Tonight, we're reading the original draft of Salem, the arrest warrants, the jail ledgers, the petitions written the night before hangings, a 4-year-old in chains, an 81-year-old man crushed under stones for 2 days because he refused to say a single word, families billed for the shackles their mothers wore, and then billed again for the corpse, and at the end of it, a name, a woman the record forgot so completely that when Massachusetts finally cleared the Salem convictions, she wasn't on the list. Her case stayed open for 329 years. It took a class of 8th graders to close it. Quick favor before the records open. This channel digs through what history edited out, and these episodes take weeks to research. If buried stories like this are your thing, subscribe, it's free, and it tells me to keep digging. That's it. That's the whole pitch. Now, light the lamp, because the first thing the record shows is that Salem didn't begin with a witch. It began with a salary dispute. 66 pounds a year, use of the parsonage, and free firewood delivered. That was the contract Salem Village offered its new minister, Samuel Parris, in 1689. And the fight over that firewood tells you more about what's coming than any ghost story ever will. Because within 2 years, the village was refusing to collect his salary. The committee voted his taxes dead. By the winter of 1691, the Reverend Parris was preaching to a congregation that was actively trying to starve him out of the pulpit. In a parsonage he was afraid of losing, in a village that hated itself. Understand what Salem Village actually was. Not the busy port town of Salem, the village inland of it. A few hundred farmers split into factions that had been suing each other for a generation. Boundary disputes, inheritance disputes, grazing rights. 2 big family networks. The Putnams on side, one's the Porters on the other, pulling every argument in the village toward one of 2 poles. The Putnams backed Parris. The Porters wanted him gone. That sounds small. It wasn't. In a Puritan village, the church was the government, the courtroom, the newspaper, and the insurance policy all at once. Losing a fight over the minister meant losing standing, losing land deals, losing the future your sons would inherit. These people did not go to war over theology. They went to war over fences and dressed it as theology. Now add the fear. This was 1692, and before you picture some medieval backwater, look at the date again. Harvard was 56 years old. Isaac Newton had published the Principia 5 years earlier. This was not the Dark Ages. This was the doorstep of the Enlightenment, and that's exactly why Salem still unsettles historians. The men who ran this colony were educated. Several owned the best private libraries in North America. But education was not the same thing as safety. Massachusetts in 1692 was a colony with its skin peeled off. A war with French-backed Wabanaki raiders was burning down the main frontier, close, enough that refugees from massacred settlements were living in Salem households, including children who had watched their parents die. Smallpox had swept through, and the colony's charter, its entire legal right to exist and govern itself, had been revoked by London. For 3 years, Massachusetts had no legally settled government, no fully functioning courts, a backlog of prisoners and disputes, and a population convinced that God was lifting his protection one judgment at a time. Frontier war, plague, constitutional collapse, a village already split down the middle. That's the firewood stacked and waiting. The match was struck in the minister's own kitchen. In January 1692, Paris's 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to break. That's the only honest word for what the accounts describe. Fits that bent their bodies backward, sensations of being pinched and pricked by something nobody could see. Words choked off mid-sentence. Hiding under furniture. Days of it. Then weeks. A village doctor. Tradition names him William Griggs. Examined the girls, found nothing his medicine could name, and reached for the diagnosis that existed for exactly this gap. He suggested the evil hand, bewitchment, and here's the detail that makes the diagnosis less innocent than it sounds. There was a bestseller about exactly this. 4 years earlier in Boston, an Irish washerwoman named Goody Glover had been hanged for bewitching the children of the Goodwin family. Children whose fits, contortions, and torments were then described, symptom by symptom, in a widely read book by the Reverend Cotton Mather called Memorable Providences. New England's ministers owned it. Doctors knew it. Whether anyone in the Paris household had read it, the script of how bewitched children behave, what it looks like, how it escalates, how seriously authority takes it, was already in circulation, sitting on the culture's shelf like a loaded form, waiting for someone to fill in the names. The girls of Salem did not have to invent a single symptom. The symptoms had a publisher. Sit with how that lands in this particular house. Paris is a failed sugar merchant turned minister, clinging to a contested pulpit in a village half of which wants him ruined. And now the affliction, the visible mark of the devil's interest, has appeared not in some far farmhouse, but in his kitchen, in his family. For a man whose enemies said God had abandoned him, there were only 2 possible stories. Either the devil had singled out the minister's house because the minister was failing, or the minister's house was under attack precisely because he was God's man on the wall. One of those stories ends his career. The other one makes him a general. The record shows which story Salem Village chose, and it shows something else. Something that should make you uneasy for the rest of this video. At every single fork in the road that follows, there were people who chose correctly, a neighbor who doubted, a juror who held out, a judge who walked away. The records preserve all of them. It hanged them anyway, or it buried them in the footnotes. Because before a single name had been spoken, before a single warrant was inked, somebody in that village decided to run a test. A piece of folk magic involving rye flour, the girl's own urine, and a dog. And that experiment, baked in a Christian minister's own household, is the moment this stops being a story about sick children. The cake was made of rye flour and the sick girl's urine, and it was fed to a dog. That was the test. An English folk remedy, older than the colony itself. If the girls were bewitched, the witchcraft would pass through their bodies, into the cake, into the animal, and the dog's behavior would reveal the witch. A neighbor named Mary Sibley ordered it done in late February, and she didn't go to the village wise woman to do it. She went to the minister's own enslaved servants, Tituba, and her husband, John Indian, and had them bake it in the parsonage kitchen. A piece of counter magic, performed in the house of the man whose job was to stand against magic, by the people with the least power to refuse. When Parison found out, he was furious. He would later say from the pulpit that the devil had been raised among them, and that the witch cake was going to the devil for help against the devil. Mary Sibley got a lecture and a public confession of error. Tituba got something else. Remember that. The instruction came from a white church member. The punishment landed on the enslaved woman who obeyed, because now the girls were being pressed by adults daily, urgently, with the only question that mattered: who afflicts you, and whether out of terror or suggestion, or the simple fact that children eventually answer the question. Grown-ups keep asking. They produced 3 names: Tituba, the slave; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who muttered under her breath when housewives turned her away; Sarah Osborne, a bedridden old woman who had scandalized the village by remarrying beneath her station and skipping church for over a year. Look at that list: a slave, a beggar, and an absentee. No church members. Nobody with a family network to defend them. Nobody whose arrest would cost the village anything at all. Whatever was wrong in Salem, the first answer it produced was the safest answer available: the 3 women already standing outside the walls. Warrants went out on February 29th, 1692, Leap Day. The examinations began on March 1st in the village meeting house, because the crowd was too big for the tavern. And here, the record starts doing the work for us, because the questions survive, word for word. The examining magistrate was John Hathorne, a Salem merchant whose great-great-grandson Nathaniel would be so ashamed of him that he added a W to the family name and wrote the Scarlet Letter. Read Hathorne's questions and you will not find an investigator. You will find a prosecutor who has already decided. Sarah Good, what evil spirit have you familiarity with? Not whether. What? Why do you hurt these children? Not did you. Why? Understand who was standing at that bar. Sarah Good was somewhere in her late 30s and looked 60. The village would later guess wildly at her age, because poverty erases even that. She'd been born a prosperous innkeeper's daughter. Her father drowned himself when she was a teenager. The estate dissolved into litigation. And 2 marriages later, she was pregnant, homeless, and hauling a 4-year-old door to door, begging shelter in a community that read her ruin as God's commentary. When housewives turned her away, she muttered. The muttering, which she said psalms, got remembered every time a cow sickened afterward. She wasn't accused because anyone saw her fly. She was accused because she was the village's walking bad conscience, and bad consciences make the shortest lists. She denied everything, and the transcript catches her doing it with an edge the clerk couldn't sand off. Her answers, he recorded, came in a very wicked, spiteful manner, with base and abusive words. A beggar talking back to magistrates. The girls were set writhing in front of her. Hathorne asked her, then, who did torment the children if she didn't? And Sarah Good did the most human thing in this entire story. She handed the fire to the woman standing next to her. It was Osborne, she said. Osborne hurt the children. The first accused had just become the 4th accuser. That's the mechanism, right there, on day 1. The trap wasn't built to catch witches. It was built so that every person inside it could only save themselves by feeding it to someone else. Sarah Osborne denied everything, too. She told the court she was more like to be bewitched, to be a witch. A frightened old woman's plea that the record preserves like a fly in amber. It didn't matter. She went to the chains with good. Then Tituba sat down, and the history of Salem turned. Who was she? The honest answer is, mostly lost. The records call her an Indian woman. The later legend recolored her at its convenience, and the best reconstruction is that Paris had brought her, with John, from Barbados when his sugar ventures failed, human remainder of a bankrupt portfolio. She had raised his children. She had baked the cake she was ordered to bake. She had less legal existence than the furniture, and she was about to become, for one season, the most listened to voice in New England. She denied it at first. The questioning continued, and we know from a contemporary account that Paris had beaten her before the examination to confess and accuse. What she did next, whether strategy or survival, or a broken person handing her tormentors exactly what they demanded, was this, she confessed, completely, extravagantly. The devil came to her, she said, and bid her serve him. A tall man from Boston, a yellow bird, a black dog that said serve me, cats, one red, one black, a book with marks in it. And in that book, she said, there were more marks than the three of them. Other names, other hands still hidden, still working. The meeting house went silent, and then it went electric. Because Tituba had just transformed the crisis. 3 outcast women, that's a containable problem, a village problem. A book of hidden names is a conspiracy, an invasion. Proof that the real witches were still out there, wearing respectable faces, sitting in the pews on Sunday. And one more thing happened so quietly that almost nobody marked it. Tituba confessed, and Tituba did not hang. The 2 women who told the truth went into a process that would kill one of them within 10 weeks. Sarah Osborne, already sick, chained in a Boston jail, was dead by the 10th of May. No trial, no verdict. The first death of the Salem Witch Trials wasn't an execution at all. It was an old woman rotting in irons before the court that would judge her, even existed. But the confessor lived. Week after week, as the jails filled, the pattern would hold with almost mathematical cruelty. Deny, and you die. Confess, and name others, and you live to testify. A justice system had just taught an entire colony that the only exit was a lie that fed it. The village absorbed that lesson fast, faster than you want to believe, because the next warrants didn't go out for beggars. The afflicted girls and the adults now clustering around them, guiding, confirming, repeating, began to name upward. A church member in full communion, a grandmother famous for piety, and a little girl small enough that the blacksmith would have to forge special shackles. She was 4 years old, and the record of what Salem did to her is where this story stops being history and starts being an autopsy. What do you do when the testimony against the prisoner is a bite mark, and the prisoner still has her baby teeth? On March 23, 1692, a warrant was issued for Dorothy Good, Sarah Good's daughter. The record keepers sometimes wrote her name as Dorcas, and the books argue about whether she was 4 or 5 years old. Hold that detail. The men documenting an emergency that threatened the entire colony could not be bothered to get a toddler's name right. But they processed her, arrest with perfect bureaucratic care. The afflicted girls said the child's specter was biting them. They showed the magistrates the proof on their arms, small rings of tooth marks, child-sized, as if a little girl's ghost had been sent out by her jailed mother to continue the family business. Dorothy was examined by the magistrates, a 4-year-old, alone, in a room full of the most powerful men she had ever seen, being asked leading questions about her mother. The accounts say she told them she had a little snake that sucked on the lowest joint of her forefinger. A gift, the examiners concluded, not from any garden, but from her mother, a familiar, a devil's mark in miniature. A child trying to be interesting for terrifying adults entered into evidence. She was sent to jail, and because Puritan Massachusetts kept receipts for everything, we know what happened next at the level of hardware. Prisoners were chained because everyone knew a witch's specter could only roam if her body was loose. Heavy irons don't come in toddler sizes. The blacksmith had to make hers, and the law of the colonies said prisoners were billed for their own shackles, their own food, their own straw. A 4-year-old, invoiced for her chains. She would wear them for between 7 and 8 months. In a stone dungeon that flooded and froze, packed with the colony's accused, lit by whatever the families of prisoners could pay for. Her mother was in the same system, but not always the same cell. Sarah Good, pregnant when arrested, gave birth in that custody. The baby, Mercy, lived a few weeks against stone and chains and a starving mother. Then she died in jail, an infant, dead in lawful custody, of nothing but the conditions her imprisonment was built from. There is no memorial with Mercy Good's name on it. She was never accused, never tried, never freed. The machine simply consumed her as overhead, and Dorothy heard everything a dungeon contains. She was inside when they came for the others. She was inside, in irons, when they took her mother out. We'll come back for her. The record does, once, 18 years later, in a single devastating sentence. Keep her in your mind every time someone on a walking tour calls Salem a quaint little episode of mass hysteria, because while the blacksmith was forging child irons, the accusations finally crossed the line everyone had assumed would hold. Martha Corey was a full member of the church, covenant member, the inner circle of the godly. She was also, fatally, a skeptic. When the village sent men to question her, she laughed. She'd been saying it out loud for weeks. The girls should be punished, not consulted. The magistrates were blind. She told the visitors she didn't believe there were witches in the country. That sentence, recorded, repeated, turned the village's doubt machine on its first respectable target. If the girls were frauds, Martha Corey was the woman who'd be proven right. The girls' party could not afford for Martha Corey to be right. She was arrested. Her own husband, an 81-year-old farmer named Giles, stubborn as a boundary stone, initially gave the court statements that hurt her. He would spend the rest of his short life walking that back, and the way he chose to walk it back is one of the most extraordinary deaths in American history. He's coming. September. Stones. We have an eyewitness for exactly this stretch of march, and his testimony is worth a minute because he had no stake in exaggerating. Deodat Lawson, a former Salem village minister himself, came back to visit just as the accusations crested and published what he saw within weeks. In the parsonage, he watched 11-year-old Abigail Williams race through the rooms with her arms flung out, crying wish, 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 as though flying. He watched her try to run into the fireplace, into the lit fire, and have to be physically held back. He heard her argue, mid-fit, with a specter only she could see, a woman offering her the devil's book. And the name the child gave that specter, in Lawson's hearing, in front of witnesses, days before any warrant, was Rebecca Nurse. So, when they named Rebecca Nurse, It did not come from nowhere. It came rehearsed. If you had asked anyone in Essex County to list the people least likely to serve the devil, Rebecca Nurse made every list. 71 years old, a mother of 8, a church member whose piety was so established that even the people testifying against her kept apologizing mid-sentence. She was frail, hard of hearing, and so far above suspicion that when the men came to tell her she'd been cried out, she had to be told twice as. What she said when it finally landed was this, and a neighbor wrote it down. She sat amazed and said, "As to this thing, I am as innocent as the child unborn." And then, the part that breaks you, "What sin hath God found out in me unrepented of, that he should lay such an affliction upon me in my old age?" She didn't ask why the village was lying. She asked what she had done wrong. That's what belief looks like from the inside. The system was so total that even its victims searched themselves for the fault. Her family did not search themselves. The nurses, the Easties, the Cloyces. Rebecca was one of 3 sisters from the town family, and that family decided to fight. 39 neighbors signed a petition testifying to her character. Read that number in context. Putting your name on that paper meant telling the afflicted girls, "We don't believe you," in writing. While the jails were filling with people the girls had named, some of the 39 would be accused themselves before summer ended. They signed anyway. It is one of the bravest documents in colonial America. File it next to the bite marks and the toddler's shackles, because both are Salem, and the second one is why the first one matters. The examinations rolled on through April like weather. Rebecca's sister, Sarah Cloyce, arrested. Her crime, as near as the record shows, was slamming the meeting house door after a sermon that condemned her sister. Elizabeth Proctor, arrested. Her husband John, a big blunt tavern keeper who'd been threatening to thrash the afflicted girls back to sanity, stood up in the proceedings to defend his wife. So they named him too. The first man in the book. By the end of spring, the jails of Salem, Ipswich, Boston, and Cambridge held dozens of the accused, chained at the colony's standard daily rate, and the thing had a momentum no village could stop, because it was no longer a village matter. The accusations were spreading through the county like fire-finding fences. Andover, Topsfield, Beverly. There was just one piece of luck left, one structural firebreak. Massachusetts had no legal court that could try them. The charter was dead. Nobody could be hanged without a government. On May 14th, 1692, a ship from England sailed into Boston Harbor carrying the new charter, the new royal governor, a rough, treasure-hunting soldier named Sir William Phipps, and the end of the firebreak. Within 2 weeks, the killing machine had paperwork. Below the Salem jail, there was a room the records politely call the dungeon, and the word is not a metaphor. Stone walls, dirt underfoot, so far below grade that the damp never left. The building stood near the tidal river, and prisoners' accounts from the era describe water seeping with the weather, the cold of a root cellar in spring, the air of one in August. No light the prisoners didn't pay for. No food the prisoners didn't pay for. The colony's standard prisoner allowance was an invoice, not a meal. This is where the accused of 1692 actually lived the witch trials. Not in the courtroom. The courtroom took an afternoon of your life. The dungeon took the rest of it. By late spring, the system held dozens. By autumn, the count across Salem, Ipswich, Boston, and Cambridge ran past 150. Farmers' wives chained next to merchants' wives. A minister's daughter beside a beggar. The irons were policy, remember. A witch's specter roamed only if her body went unsecured. So the colony's response to phantom evidence was very real hardware, billed to the wearer at the blacksmith's rate. Spend one honest minute inside that arithmetic. You have not been tried. You may never be tried. Your trial, if it comes, will be decided by screaming you can't cross-examine. And while you wait, every sunrise adds a day's fees to a bill your family is selling cattle to keep level with. Because if they stop paying, you stop eating, and if you die here, they'll be billed for the corpse. And, in at least one recorded case, for the chains that held it. People broke in that room in every direction a person can break. Sarah Osborne broke first and fastest. The bedridden woman arrested in the first sweep who had told the magistrates she was more like to be bewitched than to be a witch. 9 weeks of the dungeon spring finished what her illness had started. She died on May 10th, chained, untried, 60-ish, her estate already tangled in the lawsuits that had made her a target in the first place. First blood of the Salem Witch Trials. No gallows required, just stone and damp and a locked ledger. Others broke into compliance. The dungeon manufactured confessions more reliably than any examination, because the examination only had questions. The dungeon had time. Prisoners watched who left for trial and didn't come back, watched who confessed and kept breathing, and did the math their bodies demanded. The court would later count its 50-plus confessed witches as its proudest evidence. Would so many innocents lie, while running the exact machine that made lying the only rational act in Sex County? And one prisoner, one of the original afflicted circle, in fact, broke in the strangest direction of all. She broke toward the truth and then was broken back. Mary Warren was 20, a servant in John Proctor's house, one of the most active of the afflicted girls until her master came home. John Proctor, you'll remember, had a tavern keeper's cure for spectral torment. He reportedly sat her down at the spinning wheel, promised her a thrashing if the fits continued, and watched the affliction stop. Just stop. The household ran quietly for as long as he could keep her from the village. He told people the other girls should be handled the same way, and that loose talk would hang him in August. Because in April, when the Proctors were arrested, Mary Warren did something no afflicted girl had done. She got off the script. A note of thanks for prayers appeared. Word spread that Warren was saying the girls did but dissemble. Performance, all of it. The circle's response was instant and surgical. They cried out on her. Within days, Mary Warren was no longer an accuser, but a defendant. Same meeting house, same magistrates, standing now in the spot where her victims had stood, while her former sisters convulsed at the sight of her, exactly as she had once convulsed on cue herself. The examination record of April 19th is a document I'd make every juror in America read. She begins composed, "I look up to God and take it to be a great mercy of God." And then the room goes to work on her, the girls roaring, the magistrates pressing, session after session, day after day in the jail, and you can watch, line by line, a 20-year-old's grip peel off the truth. She is sorry for it. She falls into fits herself. She begins in fragments to say what they need, about her master, about the book. By summer, Mary Warren was back in the circle, afflicted in good standing, testifying, her recantation reclassified as the devil's interference, her surrender filed as recovery. The machine didn't just punish defection. It digested it, turned the defector into a fresh exhibit. After Mary Warren, no afflicted girl tried the door again. Whatever any of them privately understood, they now knew the price of saying so out loud, and they were children, and the adults had just demonstrated that the truth had no exit either. One more piece of context the dungeon deserves, because it corrects the biggest lie in the popular picture. People file Salem under medieval, torches, superstition, the old world's barbarism washing ashore. The truth runs the other way. Europe's great witch hunts were dying out by 1692. The continental courts that had burned thousands were winding down in embarrassment, and England's last witchcraft execution was already years in the past. Salem wasn't a survival of the old madness. It was a relapse, a modern, chartered, literate society with a printing press and a college, reassembling the machine from spare parts decades after its neighbors had scrapped it. That should worry you more than the medieval version does. The medieval version says progress fixes this. Salem says progress just files better paperwork. So hold the dungeon in your head as the trials accelerate. Because every courtroom scene you're about to watch sits on top of it. Every confession read into evidence was shaped in that stone room. Every defendant at the bar had come up out of it, blinking, half-starved, louse-bitten in billed irons, to face a jury, instructed that her haggardness was the devil's wear on his servants. And somewhere in the dark, under the courtroom, a 4-year-old was reaching the point. Her father's petition would later fix it in writing, from which she was never coming back. The court above was about to have its perfect June. The room below is what June was made of. Sir William Phipps had been in Massachusetts for 13 days when he created the court that would kill 20 people. Then he left to fight Indians in Maine. That's not a joke. That is the actual governance of the Salem Witch Trials. A brand new governor, staring at jails stuffed past capacity with accused witches, a war on his northern frontier, and a colony to reorganize, delegated. On May 27, 1692, he established a special emergency tribunal, a court of oyer and terminer, to hear and to determine, handed it to his lieutenant governor, and rode north. The man he handed it to was William Stoughton. Remember this name. Of every figure in this story, Stoughton is the one the holiday version edits out, because he ruins the comforting idea that Salem was an accident. 60 years old, Harvard-trained in theology, never ordained, never married. A career politician who had survived every regime change in the colony's bloody politics by being useful to whoever held power, and on the question of witchcraft, he held a doctrine, fixed and lethal. The devil could not take the shape of an innocent person. Stop on that sentence, because the whole machine balances on it. The core evidence in these trials was spectral evidence, afflicted witnesses testifying that a specter, an invisible shape, wearing the defendant's face, tormented them. Nobody else could see it. By definition, it could not be cross-examined, contradicted, or disproven. The only safeguard anyone proposed was theological. Maybe the devil could counterfeit an innocent person's shape, in which case a specter proved nothing. Stoughton ruled, in practice, that the devil could not, which meant if a girl said your shape hurt her, that was you. Your alibi was irrelevant, your body wasn't accused, your shape was. Your character witnesses were irrelevant, your denial was worse than irrelevant. It proved you were unrepentant. Understand what that did to the courtroom. It converted an unfalsifiable claim into conclusive proof. There is no defense against it. There has never been a defense against it. A legal system that accepts testimony nobody can test isn't a flawed court. It's a weapon with a docket, and the defendants stood in front of it alone. No defense lawyers, the law of the time, didn't provide them in these proceedings. Illiterate farm women cross-examining their accusers themselves in a packed room, while the accusers screamed and convulsed every time the defendant moved her head. The record shows defendants being told to hold still, because when they wrung their hands, the girl's hands wrung. When they shifted, the girls fell. The performance was the evidence, live, irrefutable, in front of the jury. The transcripts even preserve this test of stagecraft mid-flight. Girls crying out in open court that they saw a yellow bird on the beam above the minister's head. A black man, their phrase for the devil, whispering in the defendant's ear. Invisible objects struck at with real hands. Pins produced from skin. Testimony interrupted by choking nobody could see the cause of. Imagine defending yourself against the contents of another person's eyes. Now imagine the judge instructing the jury that those contents were, as a matter of law, you. And who sat on this bench? Not fanatics from the hills. That's the myth doing its work again. The court of Oyer and Terminer was the establishment of New England in one room. Boston merchants, councilmen, military men. Samuel Sewall, the diarist, will meet again in a church pew. John Hathorne, promoted from his prosecutorial examinations. Waite Winthrop, grandson of the colony's founding governor. Bartholomew Gedney, John Richards, Peter Sargent, Nathaniel Saltonstall. The wealthiest, best read, most experienced men the colony could assemble. That's the unsettling part. Salem wasn't a failure of the ignorant. It was the elite, operating at full confidence. The court's first test case was chosen with a prosecutor's care. Bridget Bishop, tavern keeper, thrice married, sharp-tongued, flamboyant by Puritan standards, and accused of witchcraft once before, decades earlier. The least defendable defendant in the jails. On June 2nd, she was tried, and the trial gave the court everything the textbooks of witch-finding called for, plus the one thing Salem always added, physical evidence with a backstory. 2 workmen testified that years earlier, demolishing a cellar wall in a house she'd lived in, they had found poppets, little rag and bristle dolls with headless pins stuck through them. A jury of women was impaneled to search her body and reported finding the kind of mark the manuals said the devil leaves on his own. The girls convulsed on cue. Her own denials were inventoried as lies. The jury convicted. Stoughton signed first, and on June 10, 1692, the High Sheriff of Essex County, a 26-year-old named George Corwin, carted her to a rocky ledge outside town and hanged her from a tree. Clock the speed while the rope is still moving. Examined in April. Tried June 2nd. The entire trial, evidence to verdict, fit inside the day. Dead June 10th. 8 days from gavel to ledge. It is, for all practical purposes, the speed of a court that fears its own second thoughts. The first execution. And it cracked the court from the inside. Nathaniel Saltonstall, one of the sitting judges, resigned. He gave no grand speech that survives. He simply refused to continue, walked away from the most prestigious bench in the colony, and went home. The man had watched the machine run start to finish once, and wanted no part of it. Within months, gossip would name him proof of the rule we'll watch all summer. Stepping out of the mob redirects the mob toward you, and then, 12 days after the first hanging, came the warning. The one history keeps in its footnotes because it detonates the whole "they didn't know better" defense. The court itself had asked the leading ministers of Boston for guidance. On June 15th, the ministers answered in a document called The Return of Several Ministers, drafted by Cotton Mather, and the core of it says exactly what you'd hope. Caution. Spectral evidence was not to be trusted. The devil could they wrote, sometimes appear in the shape of an innocent, even a virtuous, person. Convictions needed evidence, more considerable than the visions of the afflicted. The touch tests, the courtroom performances, unreliable, dangerous. The best theological minds in New England, on paper in June, told the court, "Your central evidence cannot hang people." That document should have ended Salem with one death, but the same paper carried a final paragraph, and the final paragraph poisoned the rest. After all the caution, it closed by recommending the speedy and vigorous prosecution of those guilty of witchcraft. The judges read the document the way men read what they already believe. Caution noted, prosecution authorized. Stoughton kept the spectral evidence, kept the touch tests, kept the calendar. So mark the date, June 15th, 1692. The court was warned, in writing, by the colony's own spiritual authorities, that its evidence was unsafe at any speed. 19 of the 20 dead of Salem died after that letter. Keep the math of that month in front of you, because the speed is the scandal. June 10th, one hanging, and a sitting judge quits over it. June 15th, the warning lands. June 30th, a jury acquits and is talked back around inside the hour. The system's own immune responses, resignation, caution, acquittal, all fired within 3 weeks. All were overridden by the same small circle of men. The court wasn't outpacing its critics with arguments. It was outpacing them with a calendar. Every signature made the next one easier and the first one harder to question, because by July, the only alternative to continuing was admitting what June had already been. This is why I told you at the start, the records make Salem worse, not better. The myth says they didn't know. The paper says they were told. The jails, meanwhile, were becoming their own instrument of death. Stone rooms built for a town's drunks now held dozens upon dozens of the accused. Chained because specters. Billed daily because policy. Witnesses described the heat that summer as suffocating, the dungeons fouled, prisoners begging family for food the jailer would log against their account. Sarah Osborne was already dead. An infant was already dead. In Boston, a minister's slave who had confessed everything sat uncharged, unkilled, and unforgotten. Tituba had bought her life with a story, and the court was keeping her like a receipt. And in the Salem dungeon, a small girl in custom irons was watching the adults around her vanish, one trial at a time. Her mother's turn came first. On June 29th, the court sat for its second session and tried 5 women in a row, among them Sarah Good, the beggar, who'd been in chains since the beginning, and Rebecca Nurse, the grandmother, with 39 signatures at her back. 5 trials, 2 days. And one of those trials produced the only 2 words this entire summer was never supposed to allow. Before the verdict, open the case files, because you should see what a 1692 prosecution actually consisted of. And the Nurse Sessions files are the genre at its purest. Susanna Martin tried the same day, had a folder that went back decades. A neighbor swore his oxen had gone mad and drowned themselves in the river after a disagreement with her. 30 years earlier, another remembered that she'd once walked a muddy road without muddying her skirts, which had struck him, on reflection, as impossible. A man testified that her specter had jumped through his window one night, years back, and lain upon him till near daylight. Elizabeth Howe's file held a neighbor child's old sickness. Sarah Wildes's, a borrowed scythe and a ruined hay crop from the 1680s. This is what the colony's evidentiary standard had become. Every cow that ever sickened after an argument, every grudge a neighborhood had been quietly amortizing for a generation, now notarized and stacked. The village's unpaid emotional debts called in all at once with the rope as the collection agency. The witch trials didn't discover any witches. They monetized 30 years of bad feeling. That was the file. Now the verdict. The meeting house was packed to the walls, the windows were open against the June heat, and the foreman of the jury stood up and said it. Not guilty. Thomas Fisk's jury, 12 property-owning men of Essex County, hand-picked under the same machinery that had already hanged Bridget Bishop, looked at the evidence against Rebecca Nurse and refused. The 39 signatures had weighed something after all. The sight of her had weighed something. 71, half-deaf, leaning toward the bench to catch the questions, answering with the flat calm of a woman who had been telling the same truth since March. I am as innocent as the child unborn. For one breath, the system worked. That's what makes this the most important hour of the entire summer. Salem's defenders, then and for 3 centuries after, would say the court was trapped by the beliefs of its age, that no one inside 1692 could have seen through it. The verdict says otherwise. 12 ordinary men, marinated in the same sermons, the same fear, the same war panic, heard the evidence and said no, and they weren't alone. The 39 signatures on her petition deserve a closer look than history usually gives them, because of who signed. Israel Porter, head of the village's anti-Paris faction, yes. But beside him, men and women from the Putnam side of every old feud, neighbors with nothing to gain and a named enemy to make. People who had known Rebecca, the petition said in its plain way, for decades. According to our observation, her life and conversation were according to her profession. Church speak 4. We have watched this woman for 40 years, and you are wrong. Ordinary farmers, in writing, against the full current. The age believed in witches. It did not require anyone to believe this. Then the courtroom answered. The moment the verdict was spoken, the afflicted girls detonated, howling, convulsing, a roar. One account calls it a hideous outcry that witnesses said spilled beyond the room. Inside the bar, the machine's true operators went to work. And here the record hands us the scene almost line by line, because the jury foreman himself later wrote it down and his statement survives. One of the judges said aloud that he was not satisfied. Another, from the bench, said the prisoner ought to be indicted anew. And Chief Justice William Stoughton, the man whose doctrine held that no innocent shape ever walked, leaned into the jury and offered them a thread to pull. He would not impose upon them, he said. But had they weighed the prisoner's own words? When the confessor Deliverance Hobbs had been brought in to testify, Rebecca Nurse had said, "What, do these persons give in evidence against me now? She is one of us. One of us." To Stoughton's construction that little phrase glowed. Us, the accused, the coven. An admission from her own mouth. Thomas Fisk took the thread back to the jury room. They could not agree. So Fisk returned to the courtroom and did the one thing left in a working justice system. He asked the defendant what she had meant, and Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old, exhausted and nearly deaf, stood at the bar and didn't hear him. She said nothing, no explanation, no defense, just an old woman's silence in a loud room. Silence that the jury, primed by the bench, could only read one way. They withdrew. They came back. Guilty. Afterward, when it no longer mattered, she explained what she had meant, and it's exactly what you already know she meant. Hobbs was one of us, one of the accused, a fellow prisoner, dragged from the same jail. How could a fellow prisoner testify, as if she were a free witness? It was a point of law, not a confession. She put it in writing for the court, being something hard of hearing and full of grief, none informing me how the court took up my words. The paper survives. The hanging happened anyway, because now watch how many hands had to sign off on this. Watch how many exits history offered. And Salem declined. The verdict reversal wasn't enough. Word of the outrage traveled, and Governor Pipps granted Rebecca Nurse a reprieve. A pause, a chance for the colony to breathe. The afflicted renewed their torments the moment the reprieve was known. And, in the words of the account that survives, some Salem gentlemen went to work on the governor. The reprieve was withdrawn. We don't have their names, we have the result. Then her own church took its turn. On July 3rd, the Salem church formally excommunicated Rebecca Nurse, cast her out of the covenant she'd spent a lifetime inside, condemned her soul ahead of her body. The congregation she'd prayed beside voted her to hell while she sat in chains. And on July 19th, 1692, the cart came. 5 women rode it together through the middle of Salem town. That was the route, deliberately public, past the shops and the wharves. The whole town turned out to watch the cart climb toward the rocky rise it would one day pretend to forget. Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Wildes, 5 nooses, 1 tree, 1 ladder, the town watching. And understand what a hanging meant in 1692, because it wasn't the engineered drop of later centuries. No trapdoor, no broken neck, no instant. You climbed a ladder with the rope at your throat, and you were turned off it. Strangulation. Slow, in front of the crowd, for a woman of 71, the same as for anyone. That is the machine the court had been signing people into all summer, not an abstraction called execution. Minutes. Witnessed 5 times in a row that morning. At the foot of the ladder, the Reverend Nicholas Noyes, Salem town's minister, one of the trial's most committed believers, made one last demand of Sarah Good. "Confess," he said. "You are a witch, and you know you are a witch." Sarah Good had been in chains since February. Her nursing infant had died against her in the dungeon. Her 4-year-old was in irons. She had nothing left but the last sentence of her life, and tradition, recorded by Robert Califf, who collected the accounts, says she spent it like this: "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink. Hold that curse. It has a receipt coming 25 years out. The records will keep it warm. The bodies were not given funerals. Convicted witches could not lie in consecrated ground. They were cut down and put into the rocks near where they died. Shallow. Some accounts say barely covered at all. We'll learn exactly how shallow 3 centuries later, when scientists finally walk that ledge with ground-penetrating radar. Another receipt. Keep it. But that night, and this is the part of July 19th that should outlive every Halloween special. A boat moved on the North River in the dark. The Nurse family had stood by her from the first day. The petition, the appeals, the reprieve. Now, by the family's tradition, her children came back after sundown, took their mother's body up out of the rocks, carried her downriver, and buried her in an unmarked grave on her own farm. Secretly, because even her corpse was contraband, a family committing midnight theft to give their mother a grave. While the colony that killed her did the accounting, the law would bill the estates for jail fees regardless of verdict. The dead woman's family settled her debts to the jail that held her for the hanging the jury voted against. Somewhere in the dungeon arithmetic of that same month, A 4-year-old's account was still accruing. Dorothy Good's mother went up the ledge on the 19th. Nobody recorded who told the child or how, or whether the irons were loosened while she heard it. The ledger only records that she stayed. And the court? The court had solved its Rebecca Nurse problem and learned its lesson. Verdicts could wobble, so the bench would steer harder. Sessions accelerated. August's docket was already filling, and at the top of it stood the name the prosecution had been saving. Not a beggar this time, not a grandmother, a minister. The man the afflicted called the ringleader of all the witches in New England. The black man's general, recruited, they said, from his own pulpit. And at the foot of his gallows, the hangings would come within one heartbeat of stopping forever. 50 miles of summer roads, and the sickness traveled all of them. While Salem's court worked through its docket, the surrounding towns were learning the new arithmetic of survival, and no town learned it harder than Andover, 15 miles northwest. Andover's plague didn't arrive by accusation. It was invited. In July, a man named Joseph Ballard had a sick wife and no diagnosis. So he did what by midsummer had become a recognized service call in Essex County. He sent to Salem Village for the afflicted girls, the living witch detectors, to come and read the invisible world over his wife's bed. They came. They were brought to the sick. They named names. And Andover, a town with no Putnam feuds and no parsonage war, fell harder than Salem itself. Before it ended, around 4 over 5 dozen Andover residents stood accused. By some counts more than any other town in the colony. The meeting house hosted the touch test at scale. Accused neighbors lined up. The convulsing girls led down the row, blindfolded, and every fit that stopped at a touch was inked into the record as contact with the witch's power, a production line for evidence that no defendant could cross-examine because the witness was a seizure, but Andover's real contribution to the horror was what happened inside its families. Because by July, everyone in Essex County had decoded the pattern. We watched Tituba discover, in March, confessors lived. The court kept confessed witches alive, as witnesses, as proof the conspiracy was real. Deniers went to Stoughton's docket. Now put yourself inside an Andover farmhouse the night after a daughter is named. You know the rule. What do you tell her? The records answer. Parents. Godly. Church covenant parents coached their own children to confess to witchcraft they had not committed. Husbands urged wives. The minister's own family watched relatives. Talked into the devil's covenant at their own kitchen tables because a lie was the only door out of the graveyard. One Andover man would later describe his wife's confession in exactly those mechanical terms. Taken down under fear, repeated back to her, signed. And once confession became a family survival strategy, it began to eat the families themselves. Anne Foster, an elderly Andover widow, confessed in July, riding a pole through the air to witch meetings in Salem Village, the devil in the shape of a bird. Days later, her daughter, Mary Lacey Sr., was arrested and confessed and implicated her own mother to do it. Then her daughter, Mary Lacey Jr., 18 years old, was brought in. And in the examination room, in front of the magistrates, with the scribe writing, the girl turned on her mother with the sentence that has survived 300 years because nobody who reads it ever forgets it. Oh, mother, why did you give me to the devil? 3 generations of one family, each buying breath with testimony against the one above. The court called it evidence. It was a pyramid scheme of survival, and the currency was your mother. Grandmother, daughter, granddaughter, all 3 condemned or jailed. The Grandmother died in her chains that December. Her son had to pay the jail to take her body home. The court would eventually release the younger two into a world where everyone had heard what they'd said. This is the machine the holiday version never shows you because it has no broomsticks in it. 50-some confessed witches in Andover, and we can read the production method for nearly everyone. The touch test for the arrest, the family coaching for the confession, the named accomplices for the release. Each confession manufactured 2 or 3 new suspects. Each new suspect manufactured a new confession. The conspiracy was self-assembling, and every link in it was rational, loving, and false. One man in Andover stood against the current the entire time, and he's the reason this chapter connects to the end of our story. Reverend Francis Dane, Andover's senior minister, in his 70s, sharp as flint, he refused to credit the touch tests, refused to validate the confessions, eventually organized the town's counterattack. A petition from Andover's leading men, in writing, telling the authorities their town's confessions were the product of fear and nothing else. The accuser's answer was the same answer they gave every doubter all year. They went after his family. By the autumn count, several dozen of the accused were Dane's relations by blood or marriage, daughters, in-laws, grandchildren. His daughter Abigail Faulkner was condemned to die. She survived only because she was pregnant, the same fragile technicality, holding Elizabeth Proctor over the drop. His daughter Elizabeth Johnson Sr. was condemned, and among the swept-up grandchildren, a quiet young woman of about 22, whose name you already know is going to outlast everyone else's in this story. Elizabeth Johnson Jr. confessed, the way Andover confessed, the way her cousins and aunts confessed, with the family rule in her ears and the dungeon as the alternative. Her grandfather, fighting for the whole clan at once, described her bluntly to the authorities as simplish at best, a young woman the modern historians read as intellectually disabled, the kind of witness a coercive examination digests in minutes. Remember the shape of her case, because we will meet it twice more, she confessed under fear, was condemned, and then, when the colony spent the next 3 centuries slowly cleaning its ledger, hers was the name that kept falling off the lists. No husband, no children, nobody downstream to file the form. The grandfather who called her simplish was trying to save her life, and did. Nobody afterward tried to save her name. Before the year was out, Andover's accusers would also quietly demonstrate how the fever breaks, because eventually they reached too far and cried out upon a gentleman of Boston, and he answered. The account that survives says, not with tears or flight, but with a defamation writ, demanding £1,000 in damages, a lawsuit. Money, the one specter the specters respected. Accusations against men with lawyers had a way of evaporating, and file that detail away, because it's the skeleton key to how this whole thing finally dies. But in the high summer of 1692, that discovery was still weeks away. The touch tests were still running, and the court had cleared its August calendar for the main event. The general was going up the ledge, and the rope was about to come within one prayer of losing the crowd. Every conspiracy needs a general. By summer, Salem had elected one, a short, dark, freakishly strong preacher who had left the village years before and who was dragged back from the main frontier in chains to find out he'd been promoted. George Burroughs had been Salem Village's minister in the early 1680s, and the village had chewed him up the way it chewed up all its ministers: salary withheld, lawsuits, departure. He'd even been arrested once over a debt to The Putnam family. Remember the factions. The village's institutional memory was long, and it kept its grudges filed alphabetically. By 1692, he was scraping out a frontier ministry in Wells, Maine, a man who had already survived 2 wars the colony kept losing. That detail matters more than it looks. Some of the afflicted accusers were war refugees from that same frontier, orphan children placed as servants in Salem households, carrying whatever the burned settlements had put into them. When their visions went looking for a devil's general, they found the face of the minister from the place where the world had ended. The specter's testimony about Burroughs went beyond pins and pinches into something like dark theater. He had murdered his first 2 wives, the ghosts said. The dead wives themselves appeared in winding sheets to the girls accusing him. He could carry a barrel of molasses with 2 fingers. He held black Sabbaths in the minister's pasture, where the witches of New England took sacrament in red bread and red wine and plotted to bring down the church itself. With Burroughs as their bishop, he was tried on August 5th. The evidence was specters, confessions extracted from terrified prisoners, and feats of strength remembered from a decade earlier. At his trial, the man who had asked the ministers for guidance in June, Cotton Mather, would later write the official account justifying the verdict. On August 19, 1692, they carted him up the ledge with 4 others. John Proctor, the tavern keeper who'd called the affliction a fraud from week 1. John Willard, a deputy constable, who, the accounts hold, had refused to keep arresting people he believed innocent. Stop on Willard for a moment, because his arc is the whole machine in miniature. A serving officer of the court, hauling neighbors to the chains, who looked at his own cargo one day and decided the prisoners were the sane ones. He quit. Within weeks, the girls cried out on him. He, Wren, made it 40 miles before they took him. And flight, of course, was entered as evidence of guilt. The system had now hanged its own enforcement for the crime of developing a conscience. Every constable still working got that message at full volume. Beside him, George Jacobs Sr., a stooped old man who walked on 2 canes and had called the afflicted girls witch bitches, and Martha Carrier of Andover, whom Mather, in print, called a rampant hag the devil had promised to make queen of hell. Look at that cart. A skeptic, a refuser, a mocker, a scapegoat, and the general. By August, Salem wasn't hanging the marginal anymore. It was hanging the opposition. George Jacobs's own granddaughter, Margaret, had confessed under examination and named him. And Burroughs, too. In jail, awaiting her own fate, she recanted everything in a written statement that survives, and the language is the clearest window we have into how the confessions were actually produced. They told her, she wrote, that if she would not confess, she would be put down into the dungeon and would be hanged. But if she confessed, she should have her life. She chose, in her own words, the easiest way, a lie, and then she chose again. She took it back, knowing the price, writing that she would rather die with a clear conscience than live with that lie on it. The night before the executions, she went to Burroughs, the man her lie had helped kill, and asked his forgiveness. He forgave her, the account says, and prayed with her. Her grandfather changed his will in jail to leave her something. Then they hanged him beside the minister. At the ledge, in front of the largest crowd these executions had yet drawn, George Burroughs was given his last words, and he turned them into a weapon. He declared his innocence. And then, balanced at the top of the ladder, he began, calmly and clearly, to recite the Lord's Prayer. You have to understand what that meant to the people watching. Folk belief repeated through the examinations all summer, held that a true servant of the devil could not say the Lord's Prayer through without stumbling. It had been used as a test in that very courtroom. The crowd had watched defendants trip on a syllable and seen it written down as evidence. Burroughs did not stumble. Word after word, perfect, composed, "Our Father, which art in heaven," a dead man passing, in front of 1,000 witnesses, the one test everyone present believed in. The account left by Robert Calef says what happened next in language you don't forget. The prayer so moved the spectators that tears gushed out abundantly, and it seemed to many that the crowd would rise and stop the execution. One heartbeat. That's how close it came. 1,000 people on a hillside, watching the machine fail its own test, weight shifting forward, and a man on a horse rode into the gap. Cotton Mather, Boston's most brilliant young minister, mounted, facing the crowd. The execution paused while he spoke. Burroughs, he reminded them, was no ordained minister. And then the sentence that did the work, the sentence that should be carved over the entrance of every institution that has ever explained away its own disproof. The devil has often been transformed into an angel of light. The prayer wasn't innocence, you see. The prayer was the trick. Perfection itself was the devil's fingerprint. The argument was unfalsifiable, which by August was the house style. The crowd settled. The ladder turned. All 5 hanged. And Calef records one more image from that afternoon, the one I'd burn into the marble if I could. When it was done, Burroughs's body was dragged by the halter to the hole between the rocks, his shirt and breeches stripped for value, an old pair of trousers from one of the executed pulled onto him. And he was put in shallow, with the others, one hand and his chin, the account says, left sticking out of the ground, the general of all the witches of New England, buried so carelessly his chin showed. Within a week, Margaret Jacobs was still in chains. Her recantation had moved her from the confessor's safe, column back into the dying one. The only thing that saved her life was squalor, a jail fever abscess. An infection in her eye delayed her trial past the date the world changed. The girl who told the truth was saved by sepsis. The summer's whole moral structure in one sentence. One man on that August cart we haven't finished with. John Proctor, on the eve of trial, had done something no other prisoner managed. He got a letter out to the ministers of Boston over the judges' heads. In it, he wrote down what was happening inside the jails. 5 Andover confessions, he said, were extracted after the accused were tied neck and heels, till the blood was ready to come out of their noses. His own son, he wrote, was tied that way. Torture, named as torture, in a letter that survives. The ministers read it. Some of them wavered. A meeting was held, cautions repeated. The court thanked everyone for their thoughts and hanged him on schedule. His wife Elizabeth was condemned too, but she was pregnant, and even Salem would not hang 2 lives on one rope. The law had a phrase for her situation, borrowed from England with the rest of the machinery. She had pleaded her belly. They wrote her execution into the calendar for after the birth, a woman in a stone cell growing a baby on jail rations with a date on the other side of it. The child would be born that winter, in custody, a son she named John, after the father the court had already taken. Born under a suspended death sentence, delivered, you could say, into the dossier. And because the attainder had legally erased his mother, she would walk out of that jail, when she finally did, into a world where she could not claim her widow's share of her own husband's estate. The law had declared her dead. The paperwork outlived the rope. It always does in this story. Keep her there a moment. Because in September, the court came back from its summer at full speed, 8 death warrants in one batch, and ran straight into the one man in New England it could not make say anything at all. The law had one hole in it, and an 81-year-old farmer found it. To be tried before a jury in 1692, a defendant had to plead, to stand at the bar and formally answer guilty or not guilty. No plea, no trial. No trial, no conviction. The machine's gears only caught you once you spoke. Giles Corey stopped speaking. You met him in the spring. Martha Corey's husband, the man whose early statements had been twisted against his own wife. The stubborn old farmer with 200 acres. And a temper that had put him in court half his life. He'd been arrested in April. He'd sat in chains through the summer and watched the system from the inside, watched the confessors live and the deniers swing, watched a jury's not guilty turn into a hanging inside an hour, watched his wife's trial date approach with the certainty of frost. Giles Corey looked at that machine and concluded the only true thing anyone concluded all year. The outcome is not connected to the input. Plead innocent, die. Plead guilty, live as a tool, then maybe die anyway. The trial was scenery. So in September, when they stood him up and demanded his plea, the old man said nothing. They demanded again, nothing. He would go to the law's edge and stand on it. You cannot try a silent man. English law had an answer for that, and it is the most medieval thing that ever happened on American soil. Peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment. The silent prisoner was to be pressed, laid on his back, a board on his chest, and weight added, stone by stone, until he either spoke or stopped. On September 17th, in an open field near the jail, the sheriff's men stripped Giles Corey, laid him down, set the planks, and began stacking rocks on a man old enough to remember the founding of the colony. He lasted 2 days. 2 days in public, under increasing stone, neighbors watching, officials cycling through to ask, again for the plea that would start his trial. The traditional account preserves his entire legal argument across those 2 days in 2 words, repeated as the boards bowed. More weight. There's one detail from the eyewitness record that I will not soften, because Salem doesn't deserve the softening. Near the end, the pressure forced the old man's tongue out of his mouth, and the sheriff, standing over him, used the tip of his cane to push it back in. That sheriff was George Corwin, 26 years old. We are not done with him. His name is all over the next chapter's receipts, and his own body has a story coming that Salem still argues about. On September 19th, 1692, Giles Corey was pressed to death without ever entering a plea. The court never got to try him. Why do it? The traditional explanation, repeated for 3 centuries, is property. A man who died untried couldn't be convicted, and a man unconvicted couldn't have his estate stripped by attainder. So his sons-in-law inherited the farm. Modern historians push back on the legal mechanics of that. What the record firmly shows is that he'd already deeded his land to his sons-in-law and that he knew either way what a trial in Stoughton's courtroom was worth. Maybe it was the farm. Maybe it was an old litigant's last, perfect contempt for a corrupt court. You want my words, die waiting. Either way, hold the image. The court that could make a jury reverse a not guilty verdict could not make one old man open his mouth. There was supposed to be a 9th body that week. Dorcas Hoare had denied her guilt for months, right up until days before the execution date, when she abruptly confessed everything and named names. Several ministers immediately petitioned for time to tend her newly valuable soul, and she was reprieved. The woman who held to the truth all summer would have died for it. The lie, told at the gallows edge, worked instantly, exactly as the system had been teaching since Tituba. She never was executed. If you want the trial's incentive structure in a single before and after, Dorcas Hoare is the receipt. 3 days later, the machine answered with its biggest day. September 22nd, 1692. 8 people on the cart. Martha Corey, widowed 3 days, hanged for the crime her husband was crushed not to answer. Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Ann Pudeator, Margaret Scott, Wilmot Red, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker. The cart struggled on the rise. A wheel caught, the account says, and the afflicted called out that the devil himself was hindering it. Even the potholes were specters now. Samuel Wardwell, a carpenter who'd confessed under pressure, then recanted the confession because, he said, he knew he died for a lie either way, addressed the crowd from the ladder. Mid-speech, smoke from the executioner's pipe blew into his face and set him coughing, and the afflicted shouted that the devil was stopping his mouth. A man choking on someone's tobacco entered into the spiritual record as evidence. That's where this colony's epistemology stood by autumn. Martha Corey went up that ladder a widow of 3 days. Her husband's pressed body barely cold, and she went up it the way she'd gone through the entire year, certain, composed, and right. The account says she ended her life with a prayer from the ladder, an eminent prayer by the standards of people who graded such things. One last recitation that, like Burroughs's, unsettled everyone it didn't save. The church that had excommunicated her in September of 1692 would formally take it back in 1703. 11 years too late to reach the ladder, and as the 8 hung there, the Reverend Nicholas Noyes, the man Sarah Good cursed in July, surveyed the line of bodies and produced the sentence that history has rightly nailed to him forever. What a sad thing it is to see 8 firebrands of hell hanging there. 8 firebrands. One of them was Mary Easty, Rebecca Nurse's younger sister, and it's her paper, not Noyce's sentence, that September 22nd should be remembered for, because Mary Easty had been released once. Midsummer, the evidence against her so thin, even this court let her go. 2 days of freedom before the girl's renewed screaming dragged her back. She knew precisely what the machine was from both sides of its door, and condemned, awaiting the rope, she did not petition for herself. Read what she actually wrote to the judges. It survives, every line. I petition your honors not for my own life, for I know I must die, and my appointed time is set. But if it be possible that no more innocent blood may be shed, she begged them to examine the confessors separately, to test the accuser's claims, to apply, in other words, the basic investigative diligence that the colony's own ministers had recommended in June. She, a condemned farm wife, reinventing due process from a death cell as a favor to her killer's future victims. She wrote that she was clear of this sin and signed it. They hanged her with the 7 others. The petition went into the files, where it sat, unanswered but undeniably received, while the court scheduled October. 19 hanged now, 1 pressed, at least 4 dead in the jails and 1 infant. The youngest prisoner in irons was learning to talk in a dungeon, and her bills were current. And yet, within 5 weeks of Noyes's 8 firebrands, the entire thing would be over. Not because the court repented, not because the evidence improved, because the specters made a mistake that no judge, no minister, and no governor could survive politically. They named the governor's wife. Before the ending, you need to see the invoice, because the part of Salem nobody puts in the costume shop window is this. The witch trials ran on a business model, and the business model is why some of the dead died. Massachusetts jails in 1692 were not state-funded warehouses. They were fee-for-service institutions. A prisoner was billed for entry, billed per day for food and straw, billed for the blacksmith who fitted the irons. Yes, the chains were a line item, and you paid for your own. Billed, in some recorded cases, for the court's own costs of processing you. Discharge required, the account settled. Read that again. An acquittal did not open the door. Payment opened the door. Now run the machine you've watched all summer through that ledger. Liza Dustin was a widow in her late 70s from Reading. Accused, jailed, held through the collapse of the entire prosecution. And in early 1693, when the fever finally broke and the new court sat, she was tried and found not guilty. Fully cleared. A free woman in the eyes of the law, she couldn't raise the feces. So the not guilty woman went back to the cell, and the winter did what winters do to 70-something bodies in unheated stone. On March 10, 1693, Lydia Dustin died in jail, acquitted, unreleased, and exactly as dead as if Stoughton had signed her warrant. The verdict said innocent. The invoice said stay. Anne Foster, the Andover grandmother, who confessed riding a pole, she died in the Salem dungeon in December 1692, 21 weeks into her chains. Her son Abraham then went to the authorities for what remained of her. The record is plain about what happened next. He paid. The family settled the jail's charges to take her body out of the prison for burial. The machine had a price for the corpse. Margaret Jacobs, the granddaughter, who recanted her lie and begged George Burroughs's forgiveness the night before his hanging, was acquitted when her trial finally came in January. Acquitted and not released. The fees stood between her and the door, and her family's estate had already been picked over. The story that survives says a stranger paid her bill. Tradition makes him a fisherman named Gammon, a man with no connection to her at all, and she walked out owing her life twice over to people the court had never heard of. The colony's official machinery had, by that point, been outperformed in mercy by one anonymous man with pocket money. Tituba, the confession that started the engine, sat in jail for 13 months. Never tried, never hanged. Her cooperation had bought that. But Samuel Parris, the minister whose kitchen this all began in, refused to pay her fees. So in the spring of 1693, the jailer recovered his costs the way you'd recover costs on livestock. Tituba was sold to an unknown buyer for the price of her bill. The first voice of the Salem Witch Trials exits the historical record on a receipt. We don't know the buyer. We don't know where she went. We never hear from her again. Sarah Good's husband William, who lost his wife to the rope, his infant Mercy to the cell, and watched his daughter Dorothy come out of 8 months in child-sized irons, filed his accounting with the colony years later when reparations finally opened. His petition says what the chains had purchased. The little girl, he wrote, was so hardly used and terrified that she hath ever since been very chargeable, having little or no reason to govern herself. That's a 17th century father saying, "My daughter never came back." Dorothy Good lived into adulthood broken, dependent, unwell, a permanent cost in a colony that measured everything in costs. In 1712, Massachusetts paid William Good £30 for the family. £30 for the wife, the baby, and the child's mind. It was among the larger settlements. Some families would not touch the money. Others fought over shares for years. The compensation files run thicker than some of the trial files. Salem's afterlife, like its crisis, was conducted in receipts. And while the prisoners were being billed, the law's officers were collecting from the other side too. Conviction carried attainder, the legal death of your property rights. And High Sheriff George Corwin enforced it with an appetite the records preserve in embarrassing detail. Cattle driven off, furniture, grain, wine, fish carried out of houses. In some cases, the seizures began before any conviction at all, which even 1692's law did not allow. The most spectacular case was Philip English, the richest shipowner in Salem, accused along with his wife Mary in the spring. The Englishes did what rich people do. They escaped, reportedly with well-placed help, and sat out the storm in New York. In their absence, Corwin and his men stripped the English estate to the studs. Household goods, warehouse stock, livestock, the works, a haul the family later valued at over £1,000. When Philip English came home, he spent years suing for it, item by item, and got back a fraction. He never forgave. His wife Mary never got the chance. Her health, the accounts hold, was wrecked by the imprisonment and the flight, and she died within 2 years of coming home. Whatever the warehouse inventory said, that was the actual price of the English file. And colonial Salem told a story about how far Philip's grudge went. That when Sheriff Corwin dropped dead of a heart attack in 1696, at just 30 years old, English moved to seize the sheriff's corpse against the debt, and the family had to guard the burial. Most historians read that tale as legend rather than ledger. But notice what kind of man it gets told about. Nobody invents corpse ransom stories about an honest sheriff. So tally the year the way the colony's own paperwork does. 19 hanged, their estates exposed to seizure. 1 man pressed to death partly. Tradition says, to keep his farm out of exactly these hands, an infant and at least 4 adults dead in cells they were paying rent on, a child invoiced for shackles, billed into permanent damage, a slave woman converted back into purchase price, a widow acquitted by a jury and killed by an unpaid bill. Now ask the question this chapter exists to ask. With every incentive in the colony, theological, political, financial, pointing toward more prisoners, more days, more fees, more forfeitures, who, exactly, was going to stop it? Not the court. The court was the machine. Not the village. The village was feeding it names, not the ministers. Their June letter was on file, and their October doubts were still in committee. The answer, when it finally came, wasn't a who at all. It was an accusation. One specter too many, pointed at the 1 bedroom in Massachusetts, with the power to close the courtroom. What was wrong with the girls? It's the question every Salem documentary promises to answer, and I owe you honesty here, because this channel doesn't sell certainty it doesn't have. Nobody knows, not for lack of trying. Salem may be the most autopsied year in American history. What we can do is walk the suspect theories the way the jurors should have walked the evidence. Coldly, one at a time. Theory 1, poison. In 1976, a graduate student named Linda Caporael published the idea that wouldn't die. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye in damp seasons, produces alkaloids related to LSD, convulsions, tingling, visions. Salem ate rye. The winter was damp. Case closed? The historians and psychologists who checked the math said no, and they said it almost immediately. Ergotism comes with a package. Violent vomiting, ravenous hunger, gangrene in the worst runs, and it doesn't negotiate. It poisons households, not selected daughters. Everyone eating from the same barrel sickens, not 2 girls in a kitchen while the family stands healthy. And it cannot explain the pattern that defines Salem. Fits that started and stopped on courtroom cue, that erupted when a defendant entered, ceased when she was ordered to touch them, and recurred, with perfect dramatic timing, at the exact moment a jury said not guilty. Fungus doesn't read the docket. The tidy chemical explanation keeps getting retold because it lets everyone off. No liars, no killers, just bad bread. The record declines to cooperate. Theory 2, fraud, cold, simple lying. And here the record does cooperate, at least in pieces. Witnesses described the girl's bite mark evidence with skepticism, even in 1692, marks that matched their own teeth. A man testified he watched one afflicted girl pick pins out of her own clothes and clasp them to her knees before crying out. Some accusers reportedly laughed between fits, and years later, tradition says one of the circle admitted they had done it for sport. Sport, the word that survives. We know the adults around the girls fed them names because the names track the adults' feuds with embarrassing precision. The Putnam family's enemies had a statistically remarkable tendency to be witches, but fraud alone can't carry it either. Because some of what those children did, you cannot fake on willpower. Weeks of contortions, self-starvation, fits in private, witnessed by skeptics looking for the strings. So, Theory 3, the one modern clinicians keep arriving at: conversion, mass psychogenic illness. Real symptoms genuinely felt, not performed, manufactured by minds under unbearable load. And look at the load. Girls raised on damnation theology, in a village at war with itself, in a colony at war with the frontier. Some of them, remember, refugees who had watched parents butchered in Maine. Puritan childhood offered girls no voice, no outlet, no future but service, and then, suddenly, one performance offered all three. The fits were real, the attention was real, the power. The first power any of them had ever held was the realest thing in the room. Grown men with swords flinched when they pointed. The honest answer is probably all three at once, braided. Some genuine breakdown at the start, shaped by adult coaching in the middle, hardened into conscious performance by the end. Because by summer, recanting meant becoming the next defendant. You watched what the circle did to Mary Warren in April for whispering the word dissemble. After her, the machine had no exit for accusers either. That's the final horror of the mechanism. By August, the girls may have been as trapped as the prisoners. And the trap had been set, in part, by what those particular children carried in. Look at the core circle's files. Several were orphans or refugees of the frontier war. Mercy Lewis, a Putnam servant, had lost her parents in a raid on Falmouth, in Maine, in the province where George Burroughs preached. Abigail Hobbs, before her arrest and pivot to star confessor, had actually lived in Falmouth. When these girls' visions needed a devil's geography, they reached for the one that had already burned them. Modern readers keep asking what was wrong with the girls of Salem. A fair number of them were unprocessed war casualties, billeted as servants in strangers' kitchens, in a theology that told them their terror was a moral defect. The fits were the first language anyone had offered them for it. But here's why this chapter sits where it sits, late after the hangings, not before. Because what was wrong with the girls is, and always was, the wrong question. It's where Salem hides its guilt. Children have fits and tell tales in every century. Children do not sign arrest warrants. They do not set bail, build dockets, admit spectral evidence over written ministerial warning, reverse acquittals, schedule hangings around pregnancies, or bill families for chains. Every door between a screaming 12-year-old and a noose was opened by an adult, with a title, a doctor who said evil hand, a minister who said conspiracy, magistrates who asked what evil spirit, a chief justice who ruled the devil couldn't counterfeit the innocent, and a sheriff who kept the receipts. The girls supplied the spark. The men built the engine around it, fueled it, and defended it from every attempt to switch it off. Past the warnings in June, past the not guilty in June, past the petitions in September. Which brings us back one last time to the room where they almost stopped it. Paranoia scales. That's the thing the judges never priced in. An accusation machine doesn't stay aimed at beggars and widows because the fuel it runs on, fear, grudges, the safety of pointing elsewhere, exists at every level of a society. Aim it long enough and it climbs. By autumn it was climbing fast. The crisis had long since burst out of Salem Village. Andover, a town that had asked the afflicted girls to visit and identify its hidden witches, actually invited the detector in, was now producing accusations at a rate that outstripped Salem itself. The Andover examinations gave us the touch test at industrial scale. Accused townspeople lined up, blindfolded, afflicted girls brought into contact with them. Every convulsion that stopped on contact logged as proof. One of Andover's own magistrates, Dudley Bradstreet, refused after signing dozens of warrants. He'd had enough, so the specters named him. He fled the colony with his wife. His brother John doubted aloud. The specters reached his dog. The animal was accused of being ridden by the devil. A dog was actually killed in the panic. One of two in the records, and John Bradstreet got out too. Even the family of Massachusetts' founding governors was now legible to the machine as prey. Some of the accusers had begun naming prominent Boston names, the wife of a minister, gentlemen of standing, people whose relatives could hire lawyers and call in favors. And the people with means had already worked out their own verdict on the court. They were leaving. Look at the pattern of the escapes, because it's a price signal. Philip and Mary English, out of Boston jail and gone to New York, where, the accounts hold, the governor of New York received them as guests. John Alden, a sea captain, son of the Mayflower Aldens, held weeks in irons, then simply broke jail and rode for Duxbury, where friends hid him until the storm passed. Nathaniel Carey of Charlestown, after watching his wife's examination descend into the touch test circus, organized her escape from custody outright and fled the colony with her. Mary Bradbury of Salisbury, in her 70s, convicted and sentenced to die, and then somehow never collected for execution, spirited away and hidden, plainly with the connivance of half her town. Notice who escapes in this story: ship money, family names, connections in New York. The dungeon's population, meanwhile, the beggars, the widows, the farm wives, stayed exactly where it was, accruing fees. Salem's machine, tested against the colony's class structure, returned a perfectly legible result. The rope was for people who couldn't afford the alternative. Every successful escape was the elite quietly marking the court's product as worthless, while still letting it run for everyone else. The fear was spreading upward, and upward in 1692 had an apex: Sir William Phipps, royal governor. Phipps had spent the summer conveniently at war in Maine, letting Stoughton's court run. He came back in late September to a colony he barely recognized. Jails holding well over 100 prisoners, fields unharvested, because so many households were chained or fled, ministers feuding in manuscript, and the death count at 20. His own letters to London from that autumn are a masterpiece of a man arranging his alibi. He had been away, he explained. The court had been the deputy governor's affair. He had found, on his return, a strange ferment of dissatisfaction, the careful past tense of a politician backing slowly away from his own signature. Because the commission that created the court, you'll remember, carried it. And then it reached his own house. Among the names now being whispered out of the afflicted circles was Lady Mary Phipps, his wife. The reports of her accusation embarrassed the government enough that Phipps would later write to London, complaining that his own family had been touched. Whether the girl's handlers ever intended to follow through hardly matters. The signal was unmistakable, and every powerful man in Boston could read it. There is no rank this cannot reach, yours either. At nearly the same moment, the intellectual ground finally gave way. On October 3rd, Increase Mather, Cotton's father, president of Harvard, the most authoritative divine in New England, delivered the assessment he did title Cases of Conscience. One sentence of it has outlived everything else written in the colony that year. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. The spectral evidence, he argued at last and in full, was worthless for conviction. The devil could wear an innocent face. The thing the ministers had hedged in June, the thing Rebecca Nurse's jury had been argued out of, the thing Mary Eastie's petition had begged them to see from a death cell, now said plainly by the one man whose word outranked the bench's theology. A Boston merchant named Thomas Brattle put the secular version in circulation the same week, a long, cold surgical letter dismantling the trials point by point. The touch tests, the coached confessions, the circular logic, the ignoramus of it all. Educated Massachusetts was no longer privately uneasy. It was on paper. Phipps moved like a man with cover at last. He barred any further use of spectral evidence as grounds for arrest or conviction. He halted the arrests, and on October 29, 1692, he dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer outright. The courtroom that had hanged 19 people in 20 weeks ceased to exist by executive order. Note the sequence, because it's the most damning timeline in American legal history. Evidence didn't change in October. The theology didn't change. The targets changed. The court was warned in June and hanged through September. It died within weeks of the accusations brushing a governor's wife and Boston's gentry. Salem's machine was never stopped by truth. It was stopped by reach. And the afflicted girls, the indispensable instruments, the living evidence, the witnesses whole courtrooms had reorganized themselves around, their ending is the most clinical proof of what the whole thing had been. In the late autumn, the girls were sent for one more time toward Gloucester to read another household suffering. Crossing Ipswich Bridge, they fell into their fits on cue. The full performance, the shrieks, the contortions that had hanged 19 people, and the travelers on the bridge looked at them and rode on. No magistrate dismounted. No names were demanded. The audience was gone. The elite had withdrawn its belief, the way you'd withdraw credit, and without the audience, there was no affliction. The fits, the record suggests, simply stopped being reported after that. Not cured, canceled. If the girls' torments had been a disease, they would not have ended when the believing stopped. They ended when the believing stopped. What remained was the inventory, roughly 150 people still in jail, dozens more accused, and a question nobody had asked all summer. What do you do with a witch crisis when you've just admitted your evidence can't see witches? The answer was a new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, seated in January 1693, same Stoughton presiding, but with spectral evidence effectively off the table. And without specters, the cases evaporated on contact. Grand juries threw out charge after charge. Of the dozens tried, the juries acquitted nearly everyone. Nearly. 3 women were convicted even under the new rules, largely on their own coerced confessions. And one of them I want you to meet properly, because the entire last act of this story belongs to her. Elizabeth Johnson, Jr. of Andover, 22 years old, granddaughter of Andover's senior minister, Francis Dane, who had fought the trials so openly that the accusers had punished him through his family, sweeping up more than 24 of his relatives. Elizabeth had confessed under examination the way Andover's terrified dozens confessed. Her own grandfather described her, in the dismissive shorthand of the time, as simplish at best. A young woman the historians gently read with some manner of intellectual disability. In January 1693, the reformed, rational, post-spectral court, the court history credits with restoring sanity, sentenced her to death. Stoughton signed the warrants immediately. Johnson and the other newly condemned, plus 5 leftover death sentences from the old court, including Elizabeth Proctor, whose baby had been born in that stone cell and whose execution was now, per the calendar, due. Graves were reportedly being prepared, and Phipps reprieved them all. When the news reached Stoughton on the bench, the Chief Justice did not take it as a judge. He took it as a man whose harvest had been stolen. He is recorded raging. We were in a way to have cleared the land of these. Who it is that obstructs the course of justice I know not, but thereby the kingdom of Satan is advanced. Cleared the land. Sit with the verb. Then he stormed off the bench. In May 1693, Phipps ordered a general jail delivery, everyone remaining freed upon payment of fees, which is why you already know some walked out in days, and some, like Lydia Dustin, never walked out at all. Picture the actual scene of that spring. Families arriving at the jail doors with purses, livestock sold at a discount, notes of credit, ransoming their acquitted relatives from the institution that had wrongly held them, settling up with the jailer line by line, while the prisoners stood in the yard, relearning sunlight. Some walked home to farms a sheriff had emptied. Some walked home to villages where the neighbor across the lane had testified about their specter, and would be at meeting on Sunday in the next pew for the rest of their natural lives. Nobody was ever punished for any of it. Hold that flat little sentence. Not one accuser, not one magistrate, not one judge, not one sheriff. No trial, no fine, no removal from office, nothing, ever. By summer's anniversary, the Salem Witch Trials were over. 20 dead by the state, at least 5 more by the cells. 1 sold, 1 child broken, 0 witches. And then, this is the part that decides what kind of story Salem actually is. The colony had to wake up the next morning, look at its neighbors across the fence, and decide what to say. It said almost nothing. For nearly 5 years, guilt moved through Massachusetts the way water moves through stone, slowly, along the cracks, and almost never where you could see it. The crops failed. The war went badly. Sickness lingered. A colony that read weather as God's handwriting looked at the 1690s and saw a verdict. Whatever the ministers said, in public, in private, the arithmetic was inescapable. Heaven had watched what Essex County did on that ledge, and heaven was not pleased. On January 14, 1697, the colony held an official day of fasting and repentance for the trials. And in Boston's South Church that morning, something happened that had no precedent in the English-speaking world. A judge stood up to take the blame. Samuel Sewall had sat on the Court of Oyer and Terminer through every session. a thoughtful, diary-keeping merchant magistrate who had signed his share of what the court produced. His small son had died that winter. His family had buckled under what he read as judgments. And so he wrote out a confession, handed it to his minister, and stood, head bowed, in front of his congregation while it was read aloud. That he was sensible of the reiterated strokes of God upon himself and his family, that he desired to take the blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men, and begging God not to visit his sin upon him, his family, or the land. Picture the room while it was read. Boston's establishment in the pews, including, by every likelihood, men who had served beside him and intended to repent of nothing. The minister reading. Sewell on his feet, silent, while his own words named him. In a culture where public standing was the nearest thing to currency, a sitting magistrate spent his on a confession the law never demanded of him. One judge, out of 9, stood up in public and said it was my fault. And then, the part that makes it real rather than theatrical, he repeated the repentance privately, annually, for the rest of his life, keeping a day of personal fasting for Salem every year until he died. He would also, years later, write one of the first anti-slavery tracts in America, a man who, having discovered he could be catastrophically wrong with the whole town's approval, seems to have rebuilt his conscience from the foundations. That same fast day, 12 men who had served as trial jurors, Thomas Fisk, the foreman from Rebecca Nurse's jury, among the signatures, issued a written apology of their own. It is the most honest institutional document of the entire affair. We ourselves were not capable to understand, nor able to withstand, the mysterious delusions of the powers of darkness, they wrote. We fear we have been instrumental, with others, to bring upon ourselves and this people of the Lord the guilt of innocent blood. We pray we may be considered candidly. We would none of us do such things again on such grounds for the whole world. The men who said not guilty were leaned on until they said guilty, and carried it for 5 years. Forgive them or don't, but notice that they signed, and the man who leaned never did. Because where, in this season of repentance, was William Stoughton, running the colony? That is the punchline history refuses to soften. The Chief Justice, who built the doctrine, kept the spectral evidence after the June warning, reversed the nurse verdict's mercy, and raged at the reprieves like a farmer robbed of his clearing, was never sanctioned, never tried, never even seriously inconvenienced. He became acting governor of Massachusetts when Phipps was recalled, governed for most of a decade, founded a college hall at Harvard that still bears his name, and died in 1701. In office, in honor, and on the record as having never once expressed regret for any of it. The system apologized through its juries and its gentlest judge. Its architect got a building. Salem Village's own reckoning came smaller and stranger. Samuel Parris, the minister in whose kitchen it began, fought his congregation for years. They stopped paying him again, this time with better reasons, until a council eased him out. His replacement, a 19-year-old named Joseph Green, spent his ministry quietly stitching the village back together, reseating enemies next to each other in the meeting house, and in 1703 leading the congregation to formally reverse Martha Corey's excommunication. And in 1706, in that same meeting house, the strangest scene of all, Ann Putnam Jr., the most prolific accuser of 1692, a 12-year-old then, a 26-year-old woman now, orphaned and raising her siblings alone, asked to be received into the church. Custom required a public confession of sin, so she stood, silent, while Reverend Green read hers aloud to a congregation full of families her testimony had buried. I desire to be humbled before God for that sad and humbling providence. It was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time, whereby I justly fear I have been instrumental, with others, though ignorantly and unwittingly, to bring upon myself and this land the guilt of innocent blood. I did it not out of any anger, malice, or ill will. She asked forgiveness, the text says, of all those unto whom I have given just cause of sorrow and offense, whose relations were taken away or accused. Rebecca Nurse's family was in the room. They are reported to have accepted it. She is the only one. Of all the afflicted accusers, the core girls whose fits ran the courtrooms, the adults who steadied and steered them, Ann Putnam, Jr., is the only one on record who ever publicly apologized. The rest scattered into ordinary lives with extraordinary silence. Betty Paris, the 9-year-old where it all began, was sent away from the village early in the crisis, recovered the moment she left the theater, eventually married a shoemaker, and lived quietly into her 70s. Abigail Williams, the girl Lawson watched trying to fly into the fireplace, party to dozens of accusations, simply vanishes from the record within the year. Whatever became of her, nobody thought it worth writing down. Mercy Lewis, the war orphan, moved away, bore a child, married late, disappeared into the ordinary. Not one memoir, not one deathbed letter that survives. The most documented year in colonial America is followed, on the accuser's side, by the loudest silence in it, and the 2 ministers whose names are welded to the trials never bent at all. Cotton Mather spent the autumn of 1692 writing The Wonders of the Invisible World. The court's official defense, commissioned while the graves were fresh, polishing the borough's verdict for posterity. And he defended the substance of it for the rest of his life. When a Boston merchant named Robert Califf spent years assembling the counter-record. The eyewitness accounts you've heard all night, the tongue and the cane, the halter and the rocks, the gushing tears at the ladder. Mather raged, and Califf's book had to be printed in London. Increase Mather, the story goes, had it burned in Harvard Yard. The record keepers fought the record. The record won anyway. You're watching it win right now. As for the Reverend Nicholas Noyes, the 8 firebrands of hell man, the minister Sarah Good answered from the latter. He lived another 25 years and died in 1717 of an internal hemorrhage, bleeding into his mouth and throat. Choking, the town said ever after, on his own blood. Make of the medicine what you will. The diagnosis belongs to the doctors, and the poetry belongs to Sarah Good. Salem certainly gave it to her. So did literature. A century and a half later, Nathaniel Hawthorne, the examining magistrate's great-great-grandson, the man who added a letter to his name to get the blood off it, put her exact curse in the mouth of a condemned wizard in the House of the Seven. Gables. God will give him blood to drink. The beggar woman, Salem wouldn't shelter, ended up haunting American literature from inside its founding family. Now, apologies are wind. Where was the law? Crawling on a schedule set by embarrassment. In 1702, the General Court declared the trials unlawful. In 1703, prodded by petitions, it began reversing individual attainders. In 1709, the survivors and heirs organized 22 cases demanding restitution. And on October 17, 1711, 19 years after the hangings, the colony passed the general reversal of attainder, and that December authorized compensation. £578, 12 shillings, total, for the 22 listed cases, the hangings, the pressing, The dungeon deaths, the seized estates, the broken survivors, divided up by negotiation among heirs. William Good's £30 for a wife, an infant, and Dorothy's mind came out of this pot. Philip English, whose plundered warehouses alone were worth double the entire fund, got nothing he considered justice, and said so for the rest of his life. And here is the catch that sings us into the final chapter, the bureaucratic trapdoor under the whole settlement. The 1711 reversal applied to the names on the petition. The families who organized, lobbied, showed up. If your convicted relative had no family left, no one to file, no one to pay the clerk, no one who remembered, your conviction stood. In the eyes of Massachusetts law, a handful of the condemned of 1692 simply remained witches, convicted, unreversed, filed. One of them was a young Andover woman her own grandfather had called simplish. The court had condemned her. The governor had reprieved her. The colony had forgotten her. She had no children, no husband, no one to carry the paperwork. Elizabeth Johnson Jr. went on living in Andover for 6 more decades, and then went on being guilty for 2.5 more centuries. The records waited. They always wait. Nobody wrote the burial places down. That is usually where the truth starts. 20 people executed by court order in front of crowds in a colony that recorded the price of a toddler's shackles. And not one official record tells us where their bodies lay. Convicted witches were denied Christian burial. The law was done with them at the rope. What we have instead is family whispers, 2 confirmed midnight retrievals, and 3 centuries of guessing. The Nurse family, you remember, came by water in the dark and buried Rebecca somewhere on the homestead, unmarked. The Jacobs family did the same for old George, and his is the strangest afterlife of all of them, because his bones kept surfacing. The family buried him on his own farm. Generations later, the grave was disturbed, the remains examined. A tall old man, toothless, arthritic, consistent in every particular. And in 1992, 300 years after the rope, George Jacobs Sr. was reburied with honors at the Rebecca Nurse homestead in Danvers. He is the only one of Salem's executed whose remains have a known resting place. The other 18 and the pressed man are wherever the knights of 1692 left them. Even the gallows was lost. Think about that. The most infamous execution site in American history, and Salem forgot where it was. For 2 centuries, tradition pointed to the high summit of Gallows Hill. The town never marked it. It took until 2016. A research team using the documents, sightline analysis from period houses, and ground-penetrating radar to confirm the real place. Proctor's Ledge, a low rocky outcrop near the base of the hill, wedged today between a residential street and a Walgreens parking lot. The radar told them one more thing. Beneath that ledge there is less than 3 feet of soil, bedrock almost at the surface. Too shallow for graves. Whatever was put into those crevices in 1692 was barely below the world at all, and it is not there now, which is the closest science will ever come to confirming the whispers. The families came at night, and they came for everyone they could carry. The city dedicated a small, dignified memorial at the ledge in July 2017, 325 years to the day after Rebecca Nurse's cart. The neighbors attended. People who live on that street, whose kitchen windows face the rocks. Salem Village itself solved its memory problem more bluntly. In 1752, it petitioned its way out of its own name and became Danvers, Massachusetts. The place where the afflictions began, the meeting house stood, the examinations ran, renamed, rebranded, a fresh ledger. The witch hunt's ground zero is not even called Salem anymore. Meanwhile, Salem town, which held the court and the hangings, eventually pivoted the other way entirely and turned the dead into an industry. Witch City. A witch in silhouette on the police cars, on the fire trucks, on the masthead of the local paper, a statue of a television sitcom witch, downtown, smiling on her broom, a 5-minute walk from the courthouse records of Mary Easty, begging for other people's lives. Every October, the city swells with visitors, on the order of 1 million in the season, by recent counts, wand shops, haunted houses, costumed crowds packing the same streets the prisoner carts used. The economy of the rope upgraded to retail. You can buy a souvenir broom 2 blocks from where a sheriff billed a family for a corpse. One town erased the memory. The other one franchised it. Neither, for centuries, marked the graves. The first monument to any of the dead took 193 years, and it wasn't the government's. In 1885, the descendants of Rebecca Nurse raised a granite shaft over the family's secret, the homestead burial ground in Danvers, where the midnight boat had brought her, and put on it a verse the poet John Greenleaf Whittier wrote for the purpose. O Christian martyr, who for truth could die, when all about thee owned the hideous lie. Her own family, 4 generations on, still doing privately what the colony would not do at all. At the dedication, they also honored the 39 neighbors who had signed. The petition itself, finally, treated as the act of courage it was. It took an outsider to make Salem useful again. In 1953, with Senator Joseph McCarthy's hearings hunting hidden communists through American institutions, secret lists, named names, careers executed on testimony nobody could test, the playwright Arthur Miller drove up to Salem, read the 1692 examinations in the courthouse, and turned them into the crucible. He barely had to change the dialogue. The play landed as an open accusation, and everyone understood the charge instantly, which is itself the verdict. 260 years on, an American audience recognized Salem's machinery from the inside, because a version of it was on television. Miller was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee himself a few years later and asked to name names. He refused. They convicted him of contempt. The conviction was thrown out on appeal, faster, you'll notice, than any witches. Salem only got its first real public memorial because of that long shadow, and because of an anniversary too round to dodge. In 1992, 300 years out, the city finally dedicated the Salem Witch Trials Memorial, a small granite courtyard beside the old burying ground, designed by an architect and an artist who understood the assignment better than 3 centuries of town fathers had. 20 stone benches, 1 per victim, each cut with a name and a date of execution, and at the threshold, carved into the granite underfoot, the victim's own recorded words. I am wholly innocent of such wickedness. God knows I am innocent. I am no witch, engraved deliberately so that the perimeter wall cuts them off mid-sentence. Mid-sentence. The design is the history, voices interrupted by a wall. Elie Wiesel, Auschwitz survivor, Nobel laureate, a man with standing on the subject of organized neighbor against neighbor death, spoke at the dedication. Visitors leave flowers on the benches now, fresh ones, year-round, for people dead 330 years. The benches hold no one, of course. The bodies were never found. They were never going to be found. You know where they went. Downriver, in the dark, in family boats. And still, the legal ledger wasn't clean. Paper is patient. The slow machinery of the law kept producing aftershocks at the rate of roughly 1 per generation. each one accidentally confessing that the previous final resolution had left someone out. In 1957, 265 years after the hangings, with descendants pressing the point, Massachusetts formally resolved that the 1692 proceedings were the product of popular hysterical fear of the devil, and cleared Ann Pudeator and certain others unnamed. Even the apology had a clerical shrug in it. The resolution was worded carefully to create no liability. Decades later, researchers and descendants tallied the rolls again and found 5 women hanged in 1692 whose convictions had still never been individually reversed. Bridget Bishop, the first one up the ledge, Susanna Martin, Alice Parker, Margaret Scott, Wilmot Red. On October 31st, 2001, 309 years after the fact, and yes, on Halloween, with the acting governor signing, Massachusetts finally cleared their names. 2001. There are people watching this video older than the legal innocence of Bridget Bishop. And still, the ledger wasn't clean. One name remained, the one we left in Andover, the Simplish girl. Condemned by the Reformed Court in January 1693, reprieved by Phipps, skipped by the 1711 Act because no one filed for her, skipped in 1957, skipped in 2001, possibly, historians suggest, because her mother shared her name, and the clerks lost one Elizabeth Johnson inside the other. She had survived everything, by the way. That's the detail that gets me. She lived on in Andover, unmarried, into her late 70s. A woman with a death sentence in her file, walking to meeting every Sunday for 50 years, among neighbors who had testified about specters. She died around 1747 and went into an unmarked grave like the rest of them. And then 300 years went by, and her case landed on the desk of an 8th grade civics class. In 2021, a teacher named Carrie LaPierre at North Andover Middle School handed her 13 and 14-year-olds a real problem. The last convicted Salem witch had never been exonerated because she had no descendants to ask, no family, no advocate. For 329 years, nobody whose job it was to care. So the class adopted her. They researched the statutes. They drafted. They petitioned the Massachusetts legislature. They were politely stalled and refiled and stalled and kept going, 3 years of it, across 2 school cohorts. A state senator, Diana DiZolio, took up their cause and finally attached the language to the state budget. And on July 28, 2022, when the governor signed it, Elizabeth Johnson Jr., dead for 275 years, condemned for 329, became, at last and officially, innocent. The last conviction of the Salem Witch Trials was closed out in the same decade you got your current phone. By children, the exact age of the children who started it. I want to put those 2 groups of children side by side for a second, because the symmetry is almost unbearable. In 1692, a circle of girls, 12, 13, 14, discovered that the adults around them would believe anything, and 20 people died. In 2022, a circle of kids the same age discovered that the adults around them had forgotten something and refused to let it stay forgotten, and a name came back from the dark. Same age, same county, more or less. Opposite instincts, the machine and the repair crew, separated by nothing but 3 centuries, and what the grown-ups in the room rewarded. So, the records held. Every receipt this story ran on. The firewood contract, the bite marks, the 39 signatures, the not guilty that wasn't, the 2 days of stones, the bill for a corpse, the 578 pounds, the budget line in 2022. Paper, start to finish, which leaves only the question we opened with, the one the jury answered correctly on June 30th, 1692, an hour before it didn't. What actually happened in that room? Go back into the meeting house. June 30th, 1692. The heat, the packed benches, the smell of a crowd in wool. Rebecca, nurse at the bar, handcuffed behind one ear. Thomas Fisk stands and says, "Not guilty." And for that one suspended moment, everything Salem pretends about itself is actually true. The system has safeguards. The jury is the conscience of the community. 12 honest men can look at fear, dressed up as evidence, and call it fear. The myth of Salem, the version that lets everyone sleep, says the tragedy was belief. They believed in witches. We don't. We're safe. It files the whole thing under superstition, like smallpox. Cured now. Couldn't recur. But you've seen the record. The verdict came in correct. Belief didn't reverse it. A judge reversed it. A judge with a doctrine that could not be wrong, leaning toward 12 tired men with a thread for them to pull. The minister's warning was already on file. He kept the evidence anyway. The crowd at Burroughs's ladder saw the test fail with their own eyes. A man on horseback talked them back into the rope. The colony's conscience worked. Again and again, at every level, juror, neighbor, constable, judge, even the resigning Saltonstall. And every single time, someone with more authority leaned in and corrected it. That's Salem, not the absence of doubt, the management of it. So when people ask what killed those 20 people, the honest answer isn't witchcraft, or ergot, or even the girls. It's the sentence that has murdered more innocent people than any other sentence in human history, the one that was operating in that courtroom an hour after not guilty. The accusation cannot be wrong because of what it would mean about us if it were. By September 22nd, on the biggest hanging day, the court wasn't protecting Salem from witches anymore. It was protecting itself from June, because every new execution was also a verdict on the previous ones. Stop, and you confess. Stoughton understood that with perfect clarity. It's the only way to read a Chief Justice raging that mercy advanced the kingdom of Satan while the graves were being dug. He wasn't defending theology by then. He was defending the docket. He defended it to his last breath, died honored, and Harvard kept the name on the hall. And the people he processed, they're the ones who left us the instructions. Strip the year down to its 3 unanswerable documents and look at what they have in common. Mary Easty condemned, not for my own life, but that no more innocent blood may be shed. The 12 jurors, would none of us do such things again on such grounds for the whole world. Ann Putnam. I desire to be humbled. I did it not out of malice. The victim thinking only forward, the instruments looking back in horror, every one of them obsessed with the same thing, not punishment, recurrence. The dead woman's last wish, the juror's nightmare, the accuser's plea. All of it is one sentence long. Don't let this run again. Then the colony renamed the village, lost the gallows, skipped the names without families, and built a gift shop. We opened tonight with a question you might not have noticed was being asked. How long does a lie hold once it's written into law? Now you know the actual number, because Massachusetts ran the experiment. 329 years. Minus however long it takes for somebody with no stake in the matter, no inheritance, no liability, not even a shared surname, to pick up the file and simply refuse to put it down. The fee system had no line item for that. Stoughton's doctrine had no defense against it. 13-year-olds, doing as a homework project what the General Court of Massachusetts could not bring itself to finish in 3 centuries. The jury said not guilty. They hanged her anyway. Her family stole her body back in the dark, and her name back over generations. The petition in 1692. The apology accepted in 1706. The homestead grave kept like a secret. The granite shaft in 1885. The memorial in 2017 with her name cut in stone at last, 40 feet from a parking lot. Rebecca Nurse has been innocent, officially, 3 separate times now. 1692 by the jury, 1712 by the colony. 2017 in granite. She was only guilty once. It took an hour. That's the part to carry out of this. Not the witches. There were none. Not the hysteria. That word does too much forgiving. Just this. Somewhere between not guilty and guilty, 12 honest men were given a thread to pull, and a room full of authority waited to see if they'd pull it. They did. Most people do. The records survive because the Puritans wrote everything down. They wanted heaven to see their diligence. 300 years later, the diligence is the indictment. Every signature is still legible. They were so sure God was watching. He was reading. If you made it here, you're the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Next on the table, another courtroom, another verdict the record contradicts. Subscribe so it finds you. And if someone you know still thinks Salem burned witches, send them this. The records have waited long enough.